All strap yourselves in. I'm going to make the jump to light speed.
Hello, ladies and germs, and welcome back to another episode of the Sando Aqua Lounge Podcast. Today, I am debuting our newest lore series, and it's a series where we explore background information about the stories in a galaxy far, far away. This information helps us better understand why characters and events play out the way they did in the Star Wars canon and legends. This series will be a lot more scripted than other episodes, so feel free to listen to those in the future and see how free-flowing we are. In this episode, we will be diving into the 7 forms of lightsaber combat, a brief explanation of the form, and Force users who specialize in each form and how these forms played out in Star Wars media. Let's begin with Form 1, Shi-Cho. Shi-Cho was the most ancient form of lightsaber techniques dating back to the earliest days of the Jedi Order. Shi-Cho was seen as a standard practice of lightsaber training and often viewed as a simplistic form. Shi-Cho was focused on killing or maiming an opponent as quickly and efficiently as possible because it favored direct attacks over acrobatic mobility. Force users of the form attacked frequently in order to take advantage of any opening the enemy presented, or to force one when necessary. However, Shi-Cho users always returned to a defensive stance after each strike and made extensive use of parries. In this way, the form maintained a consistent balance between defense and offense. Some Jedi discouraged this form because of its purpose of being aggressive to achieve its goal, but it was often used by Jedi during the Clone Wars. Shi-Cho was needed in the front lines against the B1 battle droids, as the traditional fighting form included wide, sweeping motions to strike down many enemies on the battlefield. Jedi had to become masters of this form to survive the countless battles. A notable Jedi who mastered Shi-Cho was Kit Fisto, and his mastery of the form is seen in this fight against General Grievous in the Clone Wars, and when he helped the Mon Calamari people in the water arc of Season 4 alongside Anakin Skywalker, Ahsoka Tano, and Padme Amidala. Form 2, also known as Makashi, was the second form of lightsaber combat invented by the Jedi Order. It was much more aggressive, yet also graceful combat style. It became a specialist form for duels with Sith opponents. Form 2 relied on careful and controlled strikes instead of power and strength. Crossguard lightsabers were once common among Makashi practitioners, and many of those practitioners fought in the Great Scourge of Malachor V. The aftermath is briefly shown in Rebels Season 2. Unlike Shi-Cho, which prepared warriors to face superior numbers, Makashi was more refined for one-on-one combat between Jedi and Sith. For many Jedi, Makashi represented the most refined and elegant form of lightsaber combat. In contrast to the broad sweeps of Shi-Cho, Makashi required accurate precision in every movement. This was a relic of the form's origins, when the stakes could not be higher and a single misstep could mean a sudden death at the blade of a lightsaber. Consequently, Makashi placed a high focus on techniques to avoid being disarmed, while disarming one's opponent in turn. Makashi was one of the few lightsaber forms that encouraged personalization on the part of the practitioner, for only with a unique flair and style could a duelist master their opponent's perception. A master of the form who used it across all of his appearances in Star Wars media was Count Dooku, and trained the Sith assassin Asajj Ventress in its use, though her version was less elegant than her master's, as quoted from Luminara in the Clone Wars. Dooku personalized the combat form by deliberately fighting opponents with a curved lightsaber hilt. This was to give him a slight advantage in strike speed to throw off enemies. The Grand Inquisitor was also proficient in Form 2 shown in Rebels in his fight against Kanan Jarrus and Ezra Bridger. Ki-Adi-Mundi was another master of this form, though his lightsaber combat was mostly using Form 1 in the Clone Wars. Form 3, also known as Sorsu or the Resilience form, was the third form of lightsaber combat created by the Jedi Order. It focused more on defense than attack. This form aligned quite well with the Jedi's belief system of using their powers for defending life rather than taking it. Sorsu was developed in response to the growing prevalence of blasters throughout the galaxy. It became essential for Force users to use Sorsu techniques to be able to defend themselves against blaster fire. It even got to the point where if one mastered this ability, they could deflect blaster bolts back to its source. This probability was one of the major breakthroughs in saber combat in the era of uncivilized blasters. However, deflecting blaster bolts was only one tool in the defensive arsenal of a sorcerer practitioner, who trained to block and parry lightsaber strikes, withstand numerous opponents, and above all, maintain a calm focus that allowed an appropriate defensive response to any threat. In every aspect of combat, and in contrast to Form 1's sweeping motions, Form 3 utilized tight, controlled movements and a strict economy of action. This was key to the total defense of Sorsu, and even the slightest motion risked leaving an opening for a blaster bolt, vibroblade, or lightsaber to slip through. The most notable Form 3 user is probably Obi-Wan Kenobi, who mastered the form of Sorsu, displayed in his 1v1 duels against Darth Maul in The Phantom Menace, General Grievous, and Anakin Skywalker in Revenge of the Sith. Another notable user included the master and apprentice duo Luminar and Dooley and Barriss Offee. Depa Billaba was also a master in this form as well, and taught her students, including Caleb Dune, who used Form 3 during close-quarter fighting. We see this played out in the debut episode of The Bad Batch as her clones circled her for Order 66. Kanan Jarrus later used Form 3 against the Grand Inquisitor in Star Wars Rebels. And funny enough, the Grand Inquisitor recognized this form as a staple of Billaba's instruction and was able to counter Jarrus' attempts to use it against him. Form 4, also known as Ataru, or the Aggression Form, was the fourth form of lightsaber combat invented by the Jedi Order. It was an acrobatic combat style. Ataru could be used to defend against incoming projectiles, but was best suited for open spaces and attacking, as the practitioner needed adequate room to move in all directions. Ataru is the exact opposite of Sorsu. While Sorsu was a form focused on defense, Form 4 focused almost exclusively on offense. Its practitioners sought to end a fight as quickly as possible rather than outlast the foe. If Sorsu was the calm at the center of the storm, Ataru was the storm. Ataru placed greater emphasis on the use of the Force to enhance movement in all aspects of combat. Ataru involved acrobatics, which would be performed with the assistance with the Force itself. Such acrobatics included Force jumping strikes and somersaults. With enhancement of the Force offered, the Ataru fighter would obtain considerable height with each jumping strike and could cover distances with lightning speed. As a result, the user could deliver lightsaber strikes too fast for the unaided eye to follow. It was Ataru that gave rise to galaxy-spreading legends of the supernatural powers of the Jedi. The most notable users that used Form 4 were Master Yoda in his duels against Count Dooku in Attack of the Clones, and Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith. Anakin Skywalker was notorious for using this form in every piece of Star Wars content that he's in, until he became Darth Vader. Then he needed to seriously adapt his fighting style.
Greetings, acolytes of the Force. We're glad you are listening to this wonderful exploration of all the lightsaber forms and their many various users. We recommend you check out other sections of the archives that you may enhance your knowledge and learn more. We recommend you check out the Sando Aqua Lounge. We've heard the food is questionable, but the hosts are quite lovely. You can find them on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and other places I'm sure we haven't thought of yet. All right, we're going to cut there. I can't think of anything else. We're going to cut there. We're going to cut.
Everything's under control. Situation normal.
What happened?
Had a slight weapons malfunction, but everything's perfectly all right now. We're fine. We're all fine here now. Thank you. How are you?
Form 5, also known by its two primary disciplines of Xian and Demso, was the fifth form of lightsaber combat used by members of the Jedi Order. Although it was a form geared toward and created for lightsaber combat, it was nonetheless reasonably useful for blaster deflection. Although some Jedi felt that Form 5 encouraged aggression and domination, that sentiment did not stop many Jedi from practicing the form. We are all looking at you, Anakin. Form 5's Xian variant was the first to appear. Xian continued down Sorsu's path of seeking an effective combat style in light of the continued prominence of blasters throughout the galaxy. Xian's primary focus was the use of a lightsaber to not only block and stop blaster bolts, but to reflect them back at the very enemies firing them, transforming the enemy's blaster into a weapon of the Jedi. This technique proved so successful and effective that virtually all Jedi incorporated it into their repertoires, regardless of their favorite form. This variant of Form 5 had users having a reverse grip on their lightsaber hilt. My mind immediately goes to Ahsoka Tano and Starkiller from the Force Unleashed games. The Demso variant of Form 5 developed some centuries later to address the inadequacies of the form for combating opponents in melee. Demso emphasized defense against melee attacks, particularly by foes wielding lightsabers. The principles and approach, however, were largely the same as Xian, and the maneuvers and techniques that did vary were not adequately different to mark Demso as a distinct form. Most practitioners of Form 5 practice both Xian and Demso techniques to remain prepared for any type of foe, though practitioners might have favored one over the other. Overall, Form 5 was a fluid style. Practitioners had to always be ready to spring to the attack from a defensive position and return to projection when momentum ran low. While Shicho and Ataru forced the situation and Sorsu waited patiently for an opportunity, Xian and Demso sought to control the momentum of the battle, cleverly using whatever circumstances arose to their advantage. Notable users of Form 5 were Anakin Skywalker in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, Ahsoka Tano throughout the Clone Wars, and Starkiller from the Force Unleashed video game. Form 6, also known as Naaman, was the sixth form of lightsaber combat used by various Jedi and Sith. It could be used to combine double-bladed lightsaber combat with other Force abilities like pushes and lifts. Form 6 emphasized balance and harmony. In some ways, Naaman was not as aggressive as other lightsaber forms, and this was quite intentional on the part of its developers. The Jedi who contributed to Naaman's development sought to master a style of lightsaber combat that could achieve victory without dominating the opponent. They wanted to defend themselves and even deliver justice without the temptation of power. For these Jedi, Form 4's approach, with its reliance on swiftly overpowering an opponent, was too aggressive. In spite of these moral concerns, it was also likely that these Jedi simply wanted an effective combat style that did not require the intense physical training of Forms 4 and 5. Because of the less aggressive lightsaber combat, Form 6 made extensive use of the Force to hinder and manipulate opponents' movements. These techniques could draw opponents within range for a lightsaber strike, push them away as a defensive measure, or even bind them in place. Some more martially inclined Jedi saw this approach as a poor substitute for the blade expertise, but Naaman proved both highly effective and popular. During the various wars against the Sith, Naaman was prized by some for his general versatility on the battlefield, though heavily criticized by others for being insufficiently demanding. Over time, it became the standard in lightsaber training, and by the start of the Clone Wars, was one of the most common forms of the Jedi Order. However, Naaman demonstrated itself to be inadequate for the open battlefields of the Clone Wars, proven when all the Form 6 adherents involved in the first battle of Geonosis had died in combat. In battle, Naaman more closely resembled Form 3 or 5 than the more aggressive forms. Its approach was carefully balanced, but tended to favor defense. This reflected its origins and explained its popularity among Jedi, whose primary interests lay outside of martial pursuits. However, Naaman was as distinctive as any other lightsaber form, and any Jedi or anyone who studied the traditions of the Jedi could recognize it immediately. A fighter using Form 6 had to possess not only sufficient mastery of the Force to maneuver an opponent on the battlefield, but also the mental discipline to resist relying overly on physical strike. Some notable users of Form 6 were Darth Sidious for the form's emphasis on Force powers over saber combat, and we know how powerful Sidious was with the Force. Darth Maul also mastered it with his use of his iconic double-blade lightsaber in The Phantom Menace. Jedi Master Sindrelig also mastered this form of lightsaber combat. Form 7. This form is a lot more detailed than the other forms that I've covered in this episode, so I'll try and be as concise as possible. So, Form 7, known by its two primary disciplines of Joyo and Vaipad, and also known as the Ferocity form, was the seventh form of lightsaber combat, and it was considered the most aggressive and unpredictable form. This lightsaber form has some extensive history when the Jedi and Sith had large-scale battles in the days of the Old Republic, but maybe that can be another episode. Although Joyo was designated Form 7, its development began a millennia before it was formalized. In fact, Joyo likely originated in techniques rejected from Shicho in the earliest days of the Jedi Order, techniques considered too aggressive and dangerous. In the long centuries following, the methods that would soon come to be a part of Joyo was sometimes practiced openly, sometimes in secret. Eventually, the Ferocity form gained recognition by the High Jedi Council, only to be banned a little more than a century later, and for good reason, according to the Jedi Code. Joyo was an intensely aggressive form, even more so than Form 4 and 5. What truly differentiated it from other lightsaber forms was the emotional state it fostered and even required. Form 7 was known as the Ferocity form, and with good reason. Not only did Joyo utilize a highly aggressive offense, but it required the practitioner to actively draw upon their anger and negative emotions to fuel the relentless assault. Unsurprisingly, Form 7 was controversial from its creation, and many saw its practice as a fundamental violation of the Jedi Code strictures against passion and chaos. And in many ways, it was true. It was likely that the Jedi recognized the form only because of the desperate nature of the time in which it arose, during the resurgence of the Sith approximately 4,000 years before the Clone Wars. For decades, Joyo saw significant use among the Jedi and their ancient enemies as the two orders of the Force users battled. Yet, by the end of the Great War against the Sith, many Jedi who practiced Form 7 had fallen to the dark side or come extremely close. In the aftermath of the conflict, the Jedi Council forbade the study of Joyo. Over the following millennia, this prohibition gradually relaxed to an extent. Form 7 would never again be practiced by Jedi, except those who received special permission from the Council or who defied the Council's will. To maintain the super aggressiveness of Form 7 without exhausting oneself, giving the enemy an opening, or sacrificing accuracy, a practitioner had to use the Force and channel it with every movement and strike. This focus was essentially what makes Joyo so dangerous to the enemy, but it also posed a danger to the warrior. Because Form 7 drew on a negative emotional state, drawing so heavily and continuously on the Force brought the practitioner perilously close to the dark side of the Force. This variation of the form is notably used by Darth Maul and Galen Marek, aka Starkiller. To be masters of Form 6 and 7 is an interesting combo, I find. And now, the other Form 7 variant, Vaapad, was only created in the final decades of the Jedi Order. The key creator of Vaapad was Jedi Master Mace Windu, who developed the form alongside his friend Sorrel Barg. Windu created the form to address his weakness by controlling his inner darkness and channeling it into worthy ends. For this purpose, he refined advances from the preceding centuries and, in the minds of some, finally perfected Form 7 as a true lightsaber form in line with the statements of the Jedi Code. An extremely difficult form of lightsaber combat, only a handful of Jedi trained in Vaapad before the enactment of Order 66 and the destruction of the Jedi Order. Practitioners of Vaapad drew on their anger and passion but never gave in to them. Nonetheless, compared with all other lightsaber forms which directed warriors to master their emotions, Vaapad's approach was dangerous. Well aware of the danger it posed, even Mace Windu himself was weary of allowing others to study the form outside of his own Padawan, Depa Billaba, and even Billaba herself would decide to mainly rely on Form 3 in close quarters combat, despite her training with Vaapad and even mastering it. However, it was still not as reckless as Joyo's unchecked aggression. Despite its refinement over Joyo, Vaapad was Form 7 at its best when seen in battle. The Form 7 practitioner fought with controlled fury, laying about with a combination of fierce, rapid strikes and powerful blows. Both variants of the form were as demanding physically as they were emotionally, and in some ways harked back to the direct, kinetic simplicity of Shicho. While Depa Billaba was a master of Vaapad, she preferred to bring an end to conflicts with diplomacy, using her words in the capacity as a negotiator instead of relying on violence. As said earlier, the notable user of this form was Mace Windu, shown in his duel with Darth Sidious in Revenge of the Sith. In this fight, Mace Windu gave himself entirely over to Vaapad. He allowed it to fully channel his inner darkness and accept and use Darth Sidious's darkness. When fully immersed into his form, Mace Windu's fighting prowess was such that he could allow his body to fight automatically for him without needing to direct it with his mind. Darth Sidious's own fury was used and redirected by Windu via the use of Vaapad, a process which Mace Windu mentally likened to a lightsaber deflecting a blaster bolt back at its source. So, what was the coolest lightsaber form to you? Which one do you think you would be able to master? Which one would you struggle with the most? Comment down below or DM us on Instagram. And that is all the time we have for you in the lounge today, and as always, we thank you for listening. Check us out on other platforms like YouTube for the visual audio experience, and Instagram for updates and releases and other casual posts to let you know that we're still alive, and Apple Podcasts for the iOS only users. Stay tuned for our next episode, and until then, remember,
there's always a bigger fish.